They called her the Empress of Extinction, a name etched in the ruins of 100 conquered planets. Her armor shimmered with the memories of entire civilizations silenced. But when she stormed into the medical chamber that night, ready to punish weakness, she didn't expect to find her daughter's arm being gently wrapped in gauze by a human janitor kneeling on the floor. And in that quiet, impossible moment, the galaxy's most feared sovereign forgot how to breathe. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from: star system, city, or sector. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode might just change what you think power looks like. The janitor was 6 minutes ahead of schedule when he heard it. A sound so out of place it seemed to ripple sideways through the ventilation shaft. Not a siren, not a warning tone, but something infinitely smaller. A cry. Soft, high, fractured. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong anywhere near a corridor marked Royal Medical Restricted, let alone inside it. But it threaded through the metallic silence, like a thread pulled from the edge of a memory. And somehow, it stopped him. He had been on his third loop through the sanitation zone, hauling the carbon filtration mop like it was just another tool, just another shift, just another station where no one looked him in the eye. His badge said, Level 3, Maintenance. His knees said, Earth Gravity. No one noticed janitors on Arathian Prime. That was the point. That was why humans still had jobs in these wings, because they were invisible, disposable, tolerated only in emergencies, and only just. But this wasn't an emergency. Not officially. Still, the sound came again, barely more than a hiccup of pain, muffled by metal and distance. He hesitated only a moment before dropping the mop into the filtration cradle and stepping into the vent shaft. He knew the layout. Not from permission, from repetition. 2 decades cleaning this sector taught him every duct, every shortcut, every oversight. No cameras in the old med storage corridor, no guards, just forgotten lights and the low hum of life support backups no one cared to upgrade. The cry led him, not urgently, not like an alarm. It was gentler than that, like a child who didn't want to be found, but had nothing left but the hope someone might look. He rounded the last corner and stopped. There, at the base of a cryo table far too large for her frame, sat a child. Small, alien, perfect, skin like softened pearl, eyes large and faintly luminous. She looked no more than 5, though he had no frame of reference for Threxian age. Her arm was tucked against her chest, wrapped in something that had once been part of a medical exosuit, now frayed and soaked red. She looked up. Her mouth trembled, her eyes locked on his. But she didn't scream, didn't run, she just blinked. And then she reached her uninjured arm out, not in fear, but in instinct, like she had decided, without knowing why, that he was safe. He crouched, slowly, palms open. I'm not supposed to be here, he said softly, voice low from years of disuse. Her fingers twitched, blood pooled at her elbow, and the janitor did what no one else in the galaxy had done that day. He reached into his pocket, tore a strip from his own cleaning cloth, and whispered, It's okay, sweetheart. Let's fix that. And somewhere, deep in the throne wing of a ship that had raised 100 worlds, a line was crossed that no one could see yet. The wound was shallow, maybe a slip from a splintered panel or the sharp edge of a toy discarded too hard, but it bled like her body didn't yet know how to stop it. The med drones circling her head did nothing. They blinked with idle readiness, silent and still, their scanners red with warning loops. She had clearly been scanned, sedated, measured, but not comforted. He'd seen this before. Not in aliens. In toddlers. In hospitals that smelled like bleach and abandonment. Machines knew how to detect trauma, but not how to soothe it. He slid closer. The child watched him with something between curiosity and disbelief. Her breathing hitched, not from pain, but from holding in more than a child should. Her tiny fingers gripped the torn suit fabric against her arm, like she knew it was doing nothing, but it was all she had. He knelt without ceremony, his knees hitting the alloy floor with a grunt. The old brace in his leg clicked, a remnant of a fall from another job, another world, back before humans were assigned to quiet corners of Empire ships. She flinched slightly at the sound, but didn't move away. The janitor rummaged through his tool pouch, No medkits, only cleaner tabs, utility tape, and a rusted emergency water vial. He twisted the vial open and poured half into a soft cloth, pressing it gently against the wound. She winced, hissed softly, but didn't pull back. Her skin was cool, not cold, and the blood was thinner than his, almost translucent, like starlight in liquid form. "Hurts, huh?" he muttered. "Yeah, I get it." He didn't talk to her like she was alien or royal, just like she was small, hurt, real. From a side pocket, he pulled an old gauze roll, one of the few non-regulation items he kept hidden. He'd carried it for years, hadn't used it since his own daughter fell off a slide at a recycling yard on Mars and cried harder from fear than from the scrape. He wrapped her arm gently, secure, but not tight. She watched every movement with unblinking intensity. When he was done, her arm looked oddly human, a small limb wrapped in care, in fabric stained by decades of cleaning up after those who never looked down. The cry stopped, not because the pain had disappeared, but because something else had entered. Calm, presence. The drones, still circling, whirred confused queries into the air, trying to understand the anomaly. Why vitals were stabilizing without biochemical correction. He didn't answer them. He just sat back on his heels and let the silence settle. Her breathing evened. She tilted her head, blinked twice, and reached for the pocket of his jumpsuit, the one where his daughter's old toy still lived. He let her pull it free, a tiny rubber creature with chipped paint and one eye missing. She smiled, and a mile away, a crown shivered on a stand, as its wearer felt something, a tug in her chest, where instinct should have been silence. The moment she smiled, something fragile and almost unholy passed through the room. Not a miracle, not magic, just something the galaxy had grown allergic to. Gentleness. He didn't know her name, didn't need it. The way she clutched the toy, half rubber, half memory, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about pain anymore. This was about safety, and how rare it was. He sat cross-legged now, his worn boots scuffed against the base of the cryo table. The old bandage roll coiled like a white spiral between them. The drones were still hovering, their logic circuits flickering red, their programming unable to reconcile what was happening. They'd sent at least 3 distress pings by now, he was sure of it. Royal air compromised, unauthorized human contact, violation of sovereign proximity code. But no guards came. Not yet. The little girl touched the edge of the bandage with her uninjured hand and traced it with one finger, as if memorizing the shape of care. Then she pointed at the janitor's arm, a small scar just above his wrist. He glanced down. "That," he chuckled quietly, "burn from a sterilizer valve. Years ago. I screamed like a kid too. So, you're in good company." She didn't laugh, but her head tilted in recognition. She understood enough to listen. He didn't ask why she was alone, why no medtechs had tended to her, why the daughter of the most feared empress in the known systems was bleeding on the floor of an abandoned surgical chamber with no guards in sight. Those questions would answer themselves soon enough. Instead, he reached back into his pouch and pulled out the last of his fresh wipes, standard issue for cleaning toxin residues. Not meant for skin, but if you rinsed them first, they worked fine. He cleaned her fingers. She let him. There was a rhythm to it. Slow, honest. The kind of movement you learn when you've held someone else's pain before. His hands moved like they remembered what it was like to be needed, not as a tool, not as a cleaner, but as a father. And somewhere in his mind he saw her. Not the child in front of him, but his own. Gracie. Hair always tangled. Socks never matching. She'd be 17 now, maybe taller than him. Maybe not. He blinked the memory away before it could dig in. When he looked back, the child was watching him. Still, as if she could see what he saw. As if the tear in her arm had opened something in both of them. Then she reached for his hand, and in that moment, every surveillance node in the ship's core registered the same impossible event. The heir to the Empress of Extinction initiated first contact. Voluntarily. Affectionately. That was the moment the door hissed open. That was the moment she arrived. And that was the last quiet second the janitor would ever have. She didn't enter so much as announce herself with gravity. The temperature dropped, the walls flexed inward, the overhead lighting dimmed in sequence. not because anyone commanded it, but because the ship itself remembered who ruled it. The janitor turned his head just enough to see the silhouette emerging through the vapor-thick threshold. Tall didn't begin to describe her. She was structured. Every inch of her frame a convergence of war and elegance. Her armor moved like a second skin forged in event horizon light, glimmering with inks of violet, black, and silver. A crown floated inches above her scalp, orbiting slowly, shards of crystal pulsing in sync with her breath. And in her arms, clutched loosely, not out of love but necessity, was a blade. Not ceremonial, not for show, for use. She had returned early from the massacre at Arco 7. The conquest had gone smoothly, too smoothly. She missed blood, missed silence, but something had tugged at her on the journey home. A prickling across her second spine, a heat behind her teeth, and when she had entered the command bay to find her heir not in the nursery, not in the learning chamber, not in the care of the acolytes, she had followed the drone's distress pings herself, and now she stood in the doorway, frozen, because the sight before her didn't make sense. Her daughter, her only child, the heir to a lineage carved through 100 collapsed empires, was sitting peacefully, not cowering, not shrieking, not bleeding anymore, but sitting, cradled in the open hands of a human janitor, a human. His fingers were still resting gently on the bandage wrap. His head bowed, not in deference, but in concentration, as if the rest of the room didn't matter, as if she didn't matter. That alone should have earned him obliteration. Her guards appeared half a second later, weapons drawn, voices raised in alarm frequencies. The drones reported 20 violations in unison. The janitor didn't move. The child didn't flinch. The Empress's blade twitched in her hand. And then the child did the unthinkable. She rose, just barely walked to her mother on unsteady legs, and pointed back at the janitor. Not with fear, with insistence, as if he should be allowed to stay. The Empress's blade lowered an inch. Her eyes, burning with ultraviolet flame, landed fully on the man for the first time. No armor, no status, no defense. Just a human in a faded maintenance jumpsuit with a scar above his wrist and eyes that looked like they'd seen the inside of grief and decided to keep going anyway. And the most dangerous woman in the galaxy did something she hadn't done in years. She hesitated because something in her daughter's expression and in his silence said, "This man is not what you think." Time stuttered. The guards, locked mid-motion, waited for an order that didn't come. The drones hovered in confusion, still pinging violations but no longer escalating. The command AI in the Empress's neural socket looped silently, unable to resolve the paradox, because the most feared being in the known galaxy had not spoken, and her weapon had not moved. She was still staring, not at the janitor's hands, not at the wound he had wrapped, but at the child now clinging to the edge of his jumpsuit, her small hand balled into the worn fabric like it was the anchor to a world she didn't want to leave. The janitor didn't stand, didn't explain himself. He just looked up, slow and steady, into the face of a monarch who had glassed oceans and broken moons. And he didn't blink. The Empress felt her second heart twitch, not from rage, from memory. There was something unbearably familiar about that look. He was kneeling not in submission, but in stillness. The same kind of stillness soldiers break under, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. "Identify yourself," she said. Her voice cracked the silence like ice underfoot. Half the guards flinched. One fell to a knee by instinct. The drones dropped half a meter and recalibrated, but the janitor didn't answer. The child leaned closer into his side. The Empress narrowed her gaze. "You are trespassing in a sovereign corridor. You have touched royal blood. You have approached the heir." He tilted his head slightly. "She was hurt," he said simply. "She is not your concern." The Empress snapped. "She cried," he replied, and somehow, impossibly, the temperature dropped further, because it was the wrong answer. And yet, it was true. The child looked up at her mother now, not afraid but expectant, her luminescent eyes wide with something the Empress rarely saw directed at her. Hope. That hope was not for her. It was for the man who had treated her like a person before a title. The Empress stepped forward. The floor trembled. The janitor rose. He moved slowly, carefully, his palms up, his hands still stained with the antiseptic he'd used to clean her daughter's arm. No sudden motion, no appeal, just presence, steady as gravity. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I just heard her crying," and something in the way he said it, quiet, unpolished, undeniably human, punched through centuries of conquest, like a whisper through armor. The Empress stopped, 2 steps away, close enough to kill him with thought alone. But she didn't, because her daughter was reaching for his hand again. And if she spoke now, if she gave the order, she wasn't sure who the child would cry for. In the war rooms, there were no protocols for this. And for the first time in a century, the woman who had never lost a battle had no idea what to do. The janitor's hand closed gently around the child's, not to claim, not to shield, just to steady. It was instinct, not strategy. The kind of motion you couldn't fake because you didn't learn it from manuals or training drills. You learned it from heartbreak. The Empress watched it unfold and didn't move. Every protocol screamed to act. Every part of her bred for command, raised on obedience and terror, burned with the urge to reassert control. But she couldn't. Not because of weakness, because of something worse. Recognition. The janitor's fingers were calloused, the creases of his palms stained by the kind of labor no royal would touch. And yet, the way he held her daughter's tiny hand, like it was the most delicate relic in the known galaxy, cracked something behind her ribs, not from rage, from memory. Then it fell, a small object from his pocket, rolled onto the floor with a soft clatter. She stiffened. It was old, worn to the point of absurdity. A toy, maybe. Primitive. From a forgotten age. Something squishy and small, made of a soft material that barely held shape anymore. One of its eyes had been scribbled over with marker. The other was painted crookedly. The child scooped it up immediately and held it out to her mother with pride. The Empress took a single step back, because she had seen that toy before. Not that one exactly, no. But the shape, the coloring, the odd design. On a world she had conquered 30 years ago. A world that resisted to the end, not with weapons, but with refusal. A planet of stubborn old cities that wouldn't burn fast enough. She had walked its last corridors personally, stepping over rebels who died with lullabies on their lips, and in a bunker carved beneath the final archive, she had seen just one child's toy, lying beside the body of a woman who had shielded 3 civilians with her own body. That toy had looked almost exactly like this one. She hadn't remembered it until now. Her eyes flicked up. The janitor was watching her. Not defiant, not afraid, just waiting. He bent down and scooped up the gauze roll again, slipping it back into his pouch. His hands moved like someone who had cleaned the same floors for a lifetime and didn't need to look to know where everything belonged. And then, as he stood, he said something that shook her even more than the toy. "I thought she might be cold," he murmured, nodding to the child's bare feet, and without waiting for permission, he pulled a cloth square from his belt, faded but warm, and tucked it around the girl's shoulders. The child leaned into him like the whole universe was safest under his shadow. And the Empress of Extinction, who had stood in the ruins of empires and watched stars die by her command, remembered, with terrifying clarity, what it felt like to be 5 years old and reaching for someone who never came. She should have spoken fire. That was the response her warlords expected. That was what her enemies feared. She should have incinerated the floor with a gesture, vaporized the man who stood before her, and erased the moment from history like so many others. That was the weight her crown demanded. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at her daughter, wrapped now in a janitor's cloth and cradling an ancient toy in hands, still sticky with dried blood, and she asked quietly, dangerously, "What did he say to you?" The child turned slowly, eyes wide, and pointed at her own bandaged arm. "No. Before that," the Empress pressed, her voice lowering. "What words?" The child hesitated, then opened her mouth. And what came out wasn't Threxian. It wasn't any of the 1,000 approved languages of the Empire. It was human, garbled, but unmistakably from Earth. A phrase. "It's okay, sweetheart. Let's fix that." The janitor exhaled slowly. That was what she'd remembered. Not the cleaning, not the bandage, not the touch. The words. They were old words. Simple, worn smooth by a million tired mouths. But in the royal wing of a war dreadnought that had reduced star systems to cinders, they hit like an asteroid. The Empress took a step forward, closing the space between them. "You're not a medic," she said. "No," he replied. "You're not a diplomat, not a rebel, not a spy. No, you're just a janitor." He looked down at his jumpsuit. "I clean things." The Empress stared for a long moment, then tilted her head, curious. "Why didn't you run?" she asked. He didn't flinch. She was crying. That's not an answer. It's the only one that mattered. And somehow, impossibly, the words didn't make her angry. Because they weren't challenge. They weren't defiance. They weren't anything the court was prepared to process. They were sincere. Behind her, the guards shifted nervously, unsure what part of the script they were in. None of their combat protocols accounted for human janitors who spoke like burned-out philosophers and held royal children like they'd been entrusted with something sacred. The Empress gestured to one of the drones. "Clear the corridor," she ordered. "But Empress..." A guard began. Her eyes flared. They obeyed. Within seconds, the hallway was empty. Only the Empress, the child, and the janitor remained. She waited until the hum of the last retreating drone vanished. Then she lowered her voice and asked a question no one had heard her speak since her coronation. "What's your name?" He looked at her, not like a subject, but like a man who had buried everything he ever cared about and survived anyway. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Mears." And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, the sound of it made something deep inside her tighten like a lock clicking into place on a door she didn't know she'd left open. The quiet didn't last. Within the hour, the tribunal chamber cold and tiered like an autopsy theater for justice filled with movement. Robes whispered. Protocols hissed. 100 delegates from 100 species flooded the room like blood rushing toward a wound they'd been promised would never open. The Empress of Extinction had shielded a janitor. Worse, she had spoken to him. Even worse, he had touched the air. By the time Daniel was brought in under heavy escort, his mop had been taken, his uniform scanned and resanitized. His hands, still faintly stained with the antiseptic he'd used, remained uncuffed, but only because the Empress had made that a condition of her presence. And she was present, not via projection, not through proxy. She stood beside the janitor, unmoving, unreadable, as alien nobles snarled and blinked and whispered behind talon-tipped fingers. They didn't understand what they were seeing. They only knew it was wrong. Soroth of the Crystalline House was first to speak. "This is a breach of royal containment," he hissed, his neck, spines shivering. "The human must be executed, quietly, so as not to alarm the lower sectors." Another voice joined. "We have protocols. Violations. This is not sentiment, it's sabotage." "She's compromised," spat a diplomat from the Terran remnant. "The child is imprinting on a janitor." The Empress said nothing. Daniel stood still until the tribunal's prime scribe, a withered being who'd recorded the fall of 20 civilizations without once raising his voice, leaned forward. "Human," he rasped. "Speak. The child. Did you manipulate her?" Daniel raised his eyes. "I wrapped her wound," he said. "That's not the question. It's the only one that matters." The hall erupted into overlapping howls of indignation. Soroth slammed a clawed hand against his dais. "This is mockery. You stand here as if your blood carries weight. You are nothing. A floor scrubber. A smear beneath the wheels of empire." Daniel inhaled. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the Empress. "Tell them what she did," he said softly. She blinked once and nodded. "She reached for him," the Empress said, her voice echoing like iron down a well. "Unprompted, uncoerced." Soroth staggered backward. "Impossible. No," she replied. "Uncomfortable." The scribes scratched faster. Delegates shifted. The child, now seated calmly on a bench beside the Empress's throne, hummed softly to herself as she rocked the toy between her hands. The prime scribe tilted his head. If she reached for him, what does that make him? There it was. The question no one wanted spoken aloud. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the tribunal had already felt it, the shift, the fracture, the unbearable possibility. That maybe legacy wasn't about power. Maybe it was about presence. And maybe, just maybe, the galaxy's most feared dynasty had begun to bend toward the calloused hands of a man who still knew how to kneel beside pain and whisper, "Let's fix that." The tribunal demanded precedent. The Empress offered none. There was no protocol for this. No historical document for how to classify a janitor who'd been reached for by royal blood. No chart for how to respond when the child of the most lethal regime in known space had chosen affection over ceremony. So the chamber defaulted to what it understood best: spectacle. If he is innocent, Suroth sneered from the upper tier, then let him prove his value. Let him show this court what makes a man of rags worthy of a dynasty's hand. Daniel didn't flinch. He looked at the Empress, then at the child, then at the room full of creatures who had only ever measured worth in conquest, and without asking for permission, he stepped into the center of the floor. He reached to his side and unfastened the cloth square from his belt, the one he had wrapped around the child's shoulders. He unspooled it slowly, revealing its stained edges, its softened center. It wasn't a flag. It wasn't a scroll. It was the kind of cloth you only carried when your job was to make what others ruined disappear. He knelt, not in submission but in ritual, and with hands calloused by decades of labor, he spread the cloth on the tribunal floor. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he dipped his fingers into the small dish of water provided for ceremonial cleansing and let the drops fall onto the fabric. The Empress's eyes widened, because the pattern he traced wasn't random. It was meridian, not a language, not quite, a rite. He wasn't just wiping away, he was restoring. Each motion echoed an ancient form one believed extinct, a binding of salt and cloth, a forgotten code among old custodians who had once been more than servants, who had once carried the weight of oaths in their hands instead of weapons. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. But Lear, the young Veyari apprentice who had dared speak earlier, was already moving down the tiers, eyes wide, breath caught. "I've seen this," he said, voice shaking. "In the lost tomes. The Meridian custodians, they used this to renew broken covenants." Suroth hissed. "They were myths. Broken janitors in broken records." "No," Lear replied. "They were keepers, and they only knelt when there was something sacred enough to clean." The tribunal fell into silence as Daniel pressed his palm into the wet cloth and lifted it again, revealing the ancient seal, 3 slashed lines, one broken, one whole, one crossed by a comet's tail. Gasps rippled through the chamber. The Empress stepped forward, crown pulsing faintly. She looked down at the seal, then at Daniel, and for the first time, in full view of the court that had crowned her, she lowered herself, not all the way to her knees, but enough. Enough to be eye-level with the man who had reminded her child what safety felt like. "You carry the oaths of Meridian," she said softly. Daniel didn't smile, didn't speak. He just folded the cloth again, square and neat, and placed it between them on the stone. Not as a claim, as an offering, a restoration. And from the highest tier of the chamber to the lowest dust of the floor, the galaxy trembled with the realization. A mop and a rag had shifted the axis of power farther than any throne ever had. They called it a hearing, but what followed felt more like a moment carved outside of time. No decrees were issued, no punishments handed down. The tribunal, accustomed to enforcing laws like thunder, fell silent, as if waiting for a new script to be written in the dust. And for once, they didn't write it. The janitor did. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand justice. He simply stood beside the cloth, hands folded, and watched as the Empress, no longer armored in presence, only in memory, lifted her daughter into her arms. The child didn't resist, but she didn't bury her face in her mother's neck either. She looked back at Daniel, reached out with a single small hand, and let her fingers fall open. The toy he'd given her, half rubber, half history, slipped to the floor and rolled to a stop at Daniel's boots. He picked it up gently, brushed the fabric clean with his thumb, and looked up into the Empress's eyes. She didn't flinch. This time, she spoke first. "She trusts you. I didn't ask her to." "No," the Empress said. "That's why it matters." The room breathed again, slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might shatter the balance now hanging in the space between a queen and a janitor. Suroth stepped forward. "This is chaos," he hissed. "If a child's affection now dictates policy, we are lost." "No," Lear replied from behind him, voice clear. "We are found." The Empress turned, and with the weight of every world she'd silenced behind her, she said, "Power without care is rot, and my daughter reached for someone who still remembers how to hold without hurting." Suroth fell quiet, because there was no argument left, The tribunal dissolved by unspoken accord. One by one, robes withdrew, claws lowered, and tongues stilled. No votes, no edits to doctrine, just silence, the kind that follows truth too long buried. Later, much later, after the chamber emptied, after Lear returned to the archives, and after the ships resumed their crawl across the stars, Daniel stood alone at the edge of the hall. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't ask for a promotion or a pardon. He simply retrieved his mop, pressed the tip to the wet sigil on the floor, and cleaned it, not to erase it, to preserve it. The Empress watched from the upper balcony, her daughter asleep in her arms. The child breathed slowly, her chest rising against fabric that still smelled faintly of janitor soap and stardust. And in that breath, something ancient returned. Not mercy, not redemption, but alignment. The stars outside the dreadnought didn't shift visibly, but inside the minds of everyone who had seen, everyone who had heard, everyone who had witnessed the cloth and the salt and the quiet, the constellations redrew themselves, not with fire, but with care. Because when a galaxy built on power finally sees a man clean a floor like it's a promise, it remembers what dignity feels like. And sometimes, that's all it takes to begin again.